Our next keynote speaker rolls up his sleeves by helping us educate people for a more sustainable world. He's a sustainable design advocate, a facilitator, a writer, and an activist. He's also a professor in emerging design practices at the School of Design at Aalto University in Architecture. Please help me welcome Alastair Fuad-Luke.
Okay, it's about 10 kilometers to the back of the lecture hall, so keep it warm this end. I'm going to walk around this talk. I'll say that the talk will be up on the network here at Laurier University. Those of you who know me, I put a lot of dense information in my talks. It's there when you want to go back to it, but listen to the big story here. I've only really got 3 points to make today. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully I'll have to get my talk up first, don't I? So, let's do that. Maybe we could have the lights down at the front end here. Is that possible? Is there a technical person? Yes. Thank you, technical person. Okay, it's a long title, but I'm just going to read it out because I think it's important. You're not hearing me at all? No. That's me. I'm the technical person for this one. Is that better? You still? Now it's on, okay. Remind me not to apply for a job as a technician. So, here's my talk anyway. Co-designing services to satisfy and sustain diverse capitals. It's not a surprise to any of you that economic capital is not the only capital that we have in our world, but it's the one that tends to dictate a lot of decision making. But I'm going to show you some other capitals today. Orientation. Orientation means which direction am I facing in? And measurement of value by applying the Design Capitalia framework. Design Capitalia is a working title. A framework means it's some way of framing how you approach something next. It's a way of orientating, setting your navigation, and stepping out and doing something. That's all the framework is. We could change the framework tomorrow. They're very flexible things. I start off with a couple of quotations, but I think this is quite important. This is the famous Bauhaus designer, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, fantastic individual. Design is an attitude, not a profession. What he meant was not that designers aren't professionals, but it's the attitude you bring to the designing that is so very important. And I would agree with him, although he made it in very different times in the 1930s. And then a second quote from the father of pop art in the UK, Richard Hamilton. He died sadly a couple of years ago. He said, "An ideal culture is one in which awareness of its condition is universal." We just played a little game in the workshop Coco, and one of the things that was happening there amongst the different groups as they picked a context and accompanied looking at business-to-business service is that they started to have an awareness of the culture of the two businesses. And of course culture is about relationships. So I think when you're ever doing service design, you need to have this acute awareness of the culture or cultures you're operating in. So they're my quotes for the day. I'll give you some good news first. The service economy is really being talked about. How do I know that? I think, before I show you the next slide, I think it's strange that we've always had service economies, even since the 1950s, and yet we're actually starting to use these words, service economy, a lot more. I don't know if you can see this, but I did a quick, we call it a finger in the wind, just to test something. So I put lots of different adjectives in front of the word economy, stuck it into Blackle, which is actually Google. It's just got a black screen, which saves energy, by the way, and find out how many hits there were in all these different words. And there's some funny little economic things happening down here, like right at the bottom, less than 1 million hits, the lithium economy. Anybody talked about that recently? Of course, lithium is a key ingredient in electrical batteries, and we might all be using the word lithium economy in 10 years' time. If you do, then you should speak Spanish, because Bolivia has 60% of the world's lithium. But right at the top, what I was finding, if I just go to the next slide, is that service economy was coming top by a long way. The hits on service economy, that adjective service, were right at the top. What was also intriguing is this open economy was closely behind it. And the words in purple I've highlighted here, in turquoise, what I might call the alternative economies. No surprise in a financial recession that the black economy is rising up in the discussion. The black economy is the one where you never see the taxes. It's the informal economy. It's the economy underneath. So I don't know whether this means anything. It's not exactly a piece of high academic research, but it does mean that we're talking about service design, and we're talking about the service economy, and I think that's good news. Somewhere in this conference it mentions the word value as part of the title, and I think we need to really think what that word value means. Added value, value to business, they are important values, of course, and they can be measured. But we should think about two things related to value. On the left-hand side here, if I just get my pointer, we have very precise ways of measuring value. They're standards, they're things we all agree are important. It might be GDP, or it might be measure of domestic progress, which is an alternative measure of GDP, which takes in negative costs. But they're concrete and tangible. We have, I don't know, something like 60 indicators in the UK for sustainable development. They're things we measure because we value them, and they have standard ways of measuring them. But they also have this rather more abstract idea of what value means: relative, relational, abstract, intangible. And those are based on all these things here: desirability, usefulness, fairness, reasonable return, meaning and significance. They're rather kind of difficult to pin down. And they're also based, we evaluate values, either standardized or abstracted ones, on ethical principles too. So when you use this word value, yes, you might be talking about financial value in a company, but there are many other values. And we have to ultimately ask, from the point of view of sustainability, what do we value? What do we want to value that we want to sustain? So the less good news, I think, is that although the service economy has been around for a long time, we're still struggling to design services. That was quite clear in the little game we played in your workshop, that actually, in the group I was, the company was perhaps struggling to sell their services into a bank which had services to other customers. And there was still a misunderstanding about how that might happen. So, but we have other things too. We have a very turbulent, complex world. For instance, what does happen if we use less oil in the next 30 years to all these services that we talk about? How many services, let's just do a quick show of hands. How many of the services that you're designing today are dependent on oil? Put your hands up. How many of the services are directly dependent on oil? And by the way, server farms for Google and everything else, they also depend on oil. So there weren't enough hands going up there. Almost everything we do depends on oil. So if you're going to future-proof your service, ask, what does it look like without any oil in the future? This is just a little wordle off the website's down the bottom here, Alta Service Factory, and they've got a number of projects around service design within our university. And I was just curious about the words that they were putting up top: service, design, co-design. Great. That's why I'm here, I think, because I'm talking about design. So there's an agreement somewhere that design is a very important part of services. So this is what I want to talk about today. Co-design. Co-design means designing together. The co is cooperative, collaborative, co, together. The more you can design services together with other people, the better the services will be. The second thing is which capitals we're really growing, design capitalia. And the third thing is about developing more open source tools and methods and collaborative service design practice. Actually, I could see again in the workshop that if people collaborated more on what they brief for the service was, you'd actually get better services. So let's have a look at this co-design. And I'm not using the word co-creation, but I'll come on to that. So co-design is essentially about getting many voices into the design process. This is just one definition. There must be 100 definitions of co-design, but I like this one. So really get all the voices in. And you can do that by simply thinking, you can map your stakeholders, map your key actors, go out as far as you can, and then ask, is their voice present in my service? And then you go to the co-design journal. We have an academic journal here, it's been going for 10 or more years. And they say co-designs all these things: inclusive, encompassing, collaborative, cooperative, participatory, socio-technical, and others. So no wonder people are struggling. Co-design looks like it does everything. To a degree it does, I think. But the key thing is together. There's a difference between co-creation, which again was the core theme of the workshop I was just in, and co-design. And co-creation can be any collective act of creativity, I think. But for co-design, it's collective creativity as it's applied across the whole span of the design process. So what do we mean by the whole span of the design process? Where does it start and where does it end? Well, it's changing. So if you look at Next, I don't know who knows Next Design in New York, G.K. Van Platter and people like that. You think, whoops, this is the traditional way we used to do our designing. Customers are over here, the design project team's there. Then we have multidisciplinary design teams, but the customers are still over there. And the big transformation is pulling those customers into the design team. Now the question is, when do you do that? And the reason why we're looking at this shift in the way of designing is the complexity is getting more. So it's no longer good enough to do this traditional design 1.0, or even product service design. We have to transform our organizations and maybe transform society. And if I just very quickly go through this, I said you can have the slides. This is at small scale products. Here we go into services. And here we start to talk about changing organizations. And actually, if you think about it, services can radically change if organizations can change that are delivering those services. And then if you think about other changes, if society can change, then so can the organizations and so can the services. So we have to start dealing with this level of complexity, I think, especially with some of the sustainability challenges. I found a method which I've used, and I'll be making it open source later on this year. I work with the city of Lahti, and this method, which has been proprietary, I created it in 2009, I will make open source. I'll run very quickly through it. There are several steps to it. We start here, we bring lots of actors and stakeholders into the first loop, and we find out what is the real context. We work through that loop, and then we look at the problems or the challenges. When we come out of that loop, we start to look at the design brief. It's a brief which is created with lots of actors and lots of stakeholders, and the more actors and stakeholders we can come to create that brief, the better the last part, which is the solutions. And of course we launch the solutions into the market and they become part of the context. So it's an infinity loop, of course. Round about this point, we launch them into the market and they immediately become part of the context. So we can bring anybody in at any part of the loop, but the important thing is, I think, how the loop works here. First of all, we have to share the context. This is upstream of the design brief, which is here. Then we have to understand the problems here. And what we're doing really is co-framing the context in what I call the problem space. If we don't really understand the right problem space, we'll never get the right solutions. And I think it's Einstein that said, spend 90% of your time finding the problem, and 10% of your time finding a solution. I'm not going to disagree with someone like Einstein. He was wrong on a few things, but he was right on a lot of other things. So then you get the design brief, and then we're downstream of the design brief. And this is where we can start doing solutions. And this, in my opinion, is where we do co-visioning, co-creating, co-production, and co-futuring. But you can't do all of that unless you've done this bit here. And I would ask yourselves, how good are our design briefs about new services? And by the way, who do we create those briefs with? Of course, there's lots of research happening throughout Finland. I've just picked one project here, the Atlas map. It's an ongoing project, 3 or 4 years, I think, 3 years maybe. And they pick out co-design, participatory design, user-centered design. We've got all these theories. We're not short on theory. We're not short on tools either. But we have to make it practical. This is another project we did, the Wellbeing 365 project, part of the World Design Capital. These were student teaching modules. We went into hospitals. We looked with old people how to co-design their living spaces. We looked at smoke-free lives. and I did a last project working with a small community in Lahti. So definitely within universities here in Finland and overseas, we're looking at how co-design can work with service design. It's about this. I've run many co-design workshops, maybe coming up to a couple of hundred now, and these are some of the things that I see that are essential ingredients. Why would you design something with a very small number of people? When you can design it with a larger number of people, you can get this phenomenon of collective intelligence. But it needs other things: openness, cooperation, transparency, and a few other things. This is typically the kind of stuff we can do. This is just a one-day workshop with people from the food industry to design an alternative supermarket. There's two elements to this supermarket: social cohesion. This is a supermarket, but we're growing vegetables and sharing skills and things. And the second part is the local economy. In a normal supermarket, all you can do is invest in it and buy things. You can't do all these other things. And then 2 months later, in the UK, they didn't know about our workshop, but they created this thing called the People's Supermarket. And there's our Prime Minister, David Cameron, talking to the founder. And the People's Supermarket is based on simple branding, local people involved, and more about the local economy. So it's quite interesting, from just doing a conceptual idea about what an alternative supermarket could look like, we've actually got real alternative supermarkets. I think there's about 8 in the UK now, which is a small number, but from little acorns, big things can grow. So, social innovation, certainly in the UK, we're using co-design and service design to look at service innovation in the public sector, mainly because of fiscal pressures, real financial pressures. And we've got all these sorts of techniques. These are from, I think, co-design with users. This is a typical kind of getting users to think through the situation with real props and devices in front of them. So they start to imagine what's the service journey like and everything else. This is 2 projects done in the UK, DOT 2007, Cornwall, driven by the Design Council. This is the latest one, and they really started to embed this idea of co-designing the services with communities. In a sense, I know there's a lot of business people in the audience that are saying, well, what's the relevance of this? You have just different kinds of communities. You have communities of customers, you have communities of suppliers. They're no different from communities of place. And so I think this work is relevant, and there's a series of techniques and tools that were created through these projects. There are agencies like Think Public, Live Work, Participle, Engine. These are all service design agencies in the UK that are starting to work in a more social context and develop tools. And I think some of them are even calling themselves social design agencies now. So there's a shift in kind of attitude after 10 years. What are the benefits of co-designing? Well, let's start with you first. That's all of you. Your voice is heard. You get ownership and trust. You get new types of work emerging, and you grow your networks. And I don't think anybody would say, I don't want to do any of that stuff. But there's benefits to the project: better definitions, more effective organization, improved creative process. The customers, better fit of product, meeting needs, higher satisfaction. The institution changes with co-design. The investors have reduced risk, and the same for government, and build this trust and ownership. And let's just have a quick look at the literature. I've got a couple of slides up here. You're not going to be able to read it. Go and look at the slides. This is some of the sourcing for those. I'm not making up the benefits. They're already reported in the literature. And the same here. Co-design and service design is seen as part of social design because it's a social process. So it doesn't really matter where you're working. Service design, designing those services in a co-way seems essential. So, very quickly, co-designing the city of Lahti. I was delighted to, my professorship's partly sponsored by them, and when I arrived, they had this little badge they gave me, Open Lahti. Great. Well, it is, and it isn't. They're definitely trying, and I'm helping them and encouraging them to open up the design processes, collaborate with people you don't normally collaborate with. But that's a cultural thing, and of course it takes time. We had early workshops where we said, well, actually, who is designing in Lahti? And we came up with this kind of design ecosystem, a way of looking at all the different people in the system. And it's been developed further since then. But before we had this workshop, nobody really knew who was doing the designing, and who for, and why for. And we came up with this brief here to generate ideas, have cross-functional co-design, and it had to be environmentally conscious too. And this brief is kind of embedded now in a way of working. So Prior to 2010, there was a lot of user-centered design, UCD we call it, where the users were consulted, and now we're moving a little bit more into co-design projects. I don't think there's enough analysis of how well those projects are going here, and we should be able to gain a lot more intelligence from them. But we're starting, and this is the brief launched, the strategy of the city launched on the 15th of November. Going down to a very particular community in Lahti, this is Tontila. It's the kind of cute community that I say, Nokiaization of Finland totally bypassed this community. The success of Nokia did not affect the future of this community whatsoever. Old people, poor people, people left out of the loop, maybe. But we did workshops, co-design workshops with them. Where did we do them? We did them in the bars. Where else would you do them? Don't ask people to come to a workshop, go where the people are. And this guy was brilliant. Maybe a couple of pints of beer helped. He was very creative. But the point is that once you invite people to be part of a co-design thing, they will join in and they will give you amazing intelligence. This is what Tontila looks like. Typical 1970s, 1960s housing area with a lot of problems about the infrastructure and the structure of the buildings. These are our students in a project, a Wellbeing 365 project, and they had to go out and engage. Seven-week teaching module. Okay, here's a community, dive in. And they did. And they created events. This is Ravintala Paiva. For those of you who aren't from Finland, it's a restaurant day. How am I doing? Okay, so this is the students really getting into the community. They created prototypes. This is a service they tested. For a community van to come around to ask the residents what new services they needed. Very simple. There's the markup for it. Design Capitale, I'm going to leave you with this, but the whole idea here is that we have to deal with sustainability. If you're not dealing with these capitals, you're not dealing with sustainability. If you're not getting people to participate in how we arrange these capitals, you're not dealing with sustainability. This is the model. Very simple. A series of cards, you can download it. It's free to download. Which capitals are you growing? We took Fab Lab in Alto Media Factory. We looked at the capitals they're growing. It became a strategic conversation about what they wanted to do next. These are the capitals: living, non-living, human, social, public, commercial. But you can download it. This is the final point. That if you bring different stakeholders in that are looking at these different kinds of capitals, so there are people that look at human capital, there are people that look at social capital, public capital, commercial capital. These are the capitals of nature, minerals, oils, and living capital. If you bring these different organizations in to discuss what service, they're automatically looking at more than one capital. And that's where the power of this is. And then we need to be more open source. This is what we're doing in Lahti this year. We want to create an open source co-design manual with these people, lots of different people. And that's what we bring together. That's where you can download the Design Capitale model. You must really think, what am I growing? What am I diminishing? What am I reducing? What do I want to protect? Many open source tools here for service design. There's an open source tools here for social innovation. This is all downloadable. We're not short on tools, as I said. And this is my last slide. Last weekend, 2 weekends ago, I was in Portugal, Aveiro, and we were part of the Global Service Design Jam, where they created 533 service concepts in 48 hours. That's pretty good, isn't it? And it's all open source. Go and look at the kinds of services they were creating. If you want to be stimulated, and I think that's really what we need to do, open up. And I'm sorry if I've run over. I wasn't actually looking to see.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have time for one question only.
Yeah, slow down, I think that would be it. Capitals, that's all I'd say. Who thinks of more than one capital when they do a service? Who thinks of more than financial capital? Be honest. Okay, so maybe in 2 years' time you'll all be putting your hands up. It's very important to balance those capitals.
Okay, I think we need to move on. Thank you, Alastair.